everyone for coming today. I think it should be a really interesting discussion because there is a lot happening in the law that people need to be aware of. Frankly, at this point, the law still hasn't caught up with a lot of different ways people are parenting and having children. So we've got some experts here to talk to you about ways to plan, ways to look ahead, ways to potentially affect change, and also ways to make sort of non-traditional or new kinds of families. And so I thought it would be a great thing to participate in, sort of a good place. We are the West Coast. We generally set the trend. So we're going to teach the rest of the country. It's just nobody's hearing me? Okay. That's impossible. We generally set the trend, so I think it's a good place to start to understand what's happening. And I have some really interesting people here to talk about their own experiences, also the law. First of all, let me introduce Fred Silverberg. He is the founder of Future Family Starter. Fred Silverberg, he's a family law attorney. He is a certified specialist in family law and somebody that I've known for a long time, our family's known for a long time. He's a wonderful lawyer who actually has a really strong sense of ethics and a real understanding of, how painful and difficult the process is except for Gwyneth Paltrow, how difficult it is to deal with divorce, how difficult it is to deal with different kinds of family, and that he's going to be here to talk a little bit about what it's been like working with Jason and Jason Patrick, who is another member of our panel. Let me introduce him on my left here. Jason is a father, and he is also an actor. And I've gotten to know him quite well over the last year, and and heard a lot about his story. But I want to let him talk to you about that. And I just met Rachel Hope, who has a fabulous last name. It's like my middle name. She is the author of Partnered Parenting. She's the author of Family by Choice. She is also an expert on partnered parenting. She's a mom, and she's a partnered family success coach and editor-in-chief of Partner Parenting magazine online. And in just a few minutes that I met her, she already told me a bunch of things that I didn't have any idea about. So I think you're going to learn a lot in today's session. She also has, here is her book, Family by Choice, with a really lovely picture on the cover. So she will be talking a little bit about what's in that. But first of all, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jason to start off and tell a little bit about his background, a little about his story, and we'll get ourselves underway.
Okay.
Okay.
This one.
Does yours work?
That's fine. I can run this too. I'm a father of a 4-year-old who I have not seen in 58 weeks now. I was with a woman for maybe about 4 or 5 years when we started to do fertility treatments of a child. We did that for several years, IUIs. They didn't work. The stress of the fertility process put a lot of stress on the relationship. So we had on again, breaking up. Towards 2008, we were still very close as people, and we'd gone this far, and we decided we're going to have a child, and we can co-parent this child. So we went in, and we did an IVF procedure. And I went into the IVF procedure with this woman who, at that point, I had known almost 7 or 8 years. And we went and we signed intended parent forms and did everything that one would do. These are consent forms that talk about the process, but as the man, there's no process being done to me. The only reason I'm signing these forms is to ensure that this would be the child. The forms also gave me the embryos if anything ever happened to her, and I signed them off. If anything happened to me, she could do what she wanted with those embryos. We got lucky, and Gus was born on December 3rd, first try. And we had a good parental relationship, and I raised my son from day one. After about 2.5 years, because of our own feelings, we decided to split, and went through mediation and all the things that I didn't want to do. I wanted to give him the life that he always had. And then when we had our first court hearing in September of 2012, her lawyer handed my lawyer a brief and said that you're not the father. And to which, of course, my response was, well, that's easy enough. We'll just do a DNA test. And they said, no, it's much more complicated than that. They're saying under this statute, 7613, that was written 40 years ago for sperm donors, that you technically are a sperm donor and you have no right to your child, the child that I had raised at that point for 2.5 years, supported, put in school. So we went through a lengthy court battle, and this judge deemed the statute, which Fred can tell you a bit more, I can tell you in layman's terms, basically says if an unmarried man and woman go and see a licensed professional and that man gives his sperm to that licensed professional, unless they have a writing between them to raise that child, agreement, that man has no natural rights. Now that was done 40 years ago for college kids that were sperm donors, or to protect them financially, and also to protect the woman to have no rights. This statute was originally written before there was such thing as IVF or a test tube baby. So her lawyers found this, manipulated it, and managed to sell it, to a judge. Even though I have papers that say I intend to be a parent, Jason Patrick and Daniel Schreiber intend to be a parent.
Okay, so let's move along and give that to Fred so he can talk a little bit. Everybody just sort of give a brief introduction, and then we'll come back and give a longer discussion, have a longer discussion. But go ahead.
As Allison said, I'm Fred Silberberg. I am an attorney that works in this area. My practice is primarily family law, custody disputes, parentage issues, those kinds of things. And I also have an additional practice that deals with assisting people who are having children who are either unmarried or who need to use IVF procedures. And my connection to Jason is that I'm his attorney in the ongoing case with Ms. Schreiber over the parentage issue of Gus.
Well, I'm Rachel Hope. I wrote a book called Family by Choice, and I wrote the book to give other people the benefit of my 24 years of experience raising kids. I have 2 kids, 2 different parenting partnerships, in an unconventional family, in a family where we started out as partners, intending to be partners and not a married couple or romantic couple. So there's so many types of modern families, as Yvonne is saying. This is giving a lot of concern about the law and how the law is going to treat us, families who do these new spectrum of all these choices we have. And in addition to that, my second child I had with a known donor. And I had that experience being a mom with a known donor and believing that known donor was going to have limited, kind of more uncle type involvement with my child, and having everything get upset and then renegotiating that agreement in the best interest of the child, avoiding legal battles because the precedent hasn't been set. So my book and my message, my advocacy, is to be diligent, incredible, impeccable with talking everything through about the partnership and what is going to happen before the child's ever conceived, and that's what I'm advocating for.
Okay. All right, so we're going to start off, and I'm just going to talk to Jason and ask a few questions about his situation. First of all, give a sense of what kind of a relationship you had, and first of all, let me just say this. I know that Ms. Schreiber they've been on the news. She's given her side. Her feeling is that Jason was not this child's father, and Jason's going to talk about how he was the child's father, what kind of a relationship they had, how long it's been since he's seen Gus, and basically give a sense of how it is that your parental rights were terminated, but what things were like before that happened.
It's not much different than anyone else has ever had a child. I mean, the baby was born, and from day one, your life changes. Whether it's taking to get circumcised at 8 days old, or trying to put him in the crib, and anything that one would do. I find it incredibly strange, but I've been living this Kafka world for the last 2 years, that to even have to explain what it's like, being a parent, somehow to justify being a parent, that's the most difficult thing for me. And the separation by a completely broken system, that this can happen to me and that it can happen to anyone purely because I was unmarried. If I took every single step and signed every single paper that I did and I'm married, that's my son. A little another little thing is that the fact that I handed my sperm to the doctor made me not the father. If I gave that exact day, gave that cup to Danielle Schreiber and she brought it in, I'm the father. This is absurd. And not only that, we did our previous one more IUI before IVF we did in January. Our IVF was March, so a few months before we tried one more time. I did give that sample at home. If Gus had resulted from that, I'm the father. Instead, I have not seen my son in 58 weeks.
Okay, so you didn't have a marriage? Did you live together with Miss Schreiber? Did you have like a co-parenting family arrangement?
Well, I never heard the word co-parenting or co-family till you get into this, you know. We're going to have a kid and we're going to raise the kid. So, yeah, I mean, he lived 10 minutes from me in her house because she wanted to work out of her office. And
I hadn't heard it either until I met you.
Right.
And I have children, too.
So, you know, and we decided she wanted to nurse for a very long amount of time. So either I would stay over there or I'd come in the morning or at night, you know. Regardless of what went on in our relationship, the one solid constant was Gus always had his mama and his dada and knew no difference. And that's the thing that's important, is always making it about the child. And unfortunately, as we know in divorce, they're far too often used as pawns. And now we're in a situation with fertility and certainly same-sex couples where this can be very, very dangerous. So it's important, I feel, not only, of course, I want my son back, but this is important for a lot of other people. And so I'm, you know, giving it everything I can, clearly.
Let me ask you this, too. Has Danielle Schreiber made any attempts to work out any kind of an agreement, or is she completely, I mean, I know the answer to it, but I want you guys to hear what really has happened to Jason, or is she completely committed to you never regaining your parental rights?
To never seeing my son again. This literally went from a Father's Day on June 17, 2012, to 2 weeks later after the split, here's my attorney, and then 2 months later they found the statute. And Fred can tell you of all the legal machinations and letters in our on go ahead.
I want to ask you, Fred, to just give a sense of how it was that a judge determined on what basis that Jason's parental rights should be terminated, and a little sense of what happened in that courtroom.
Okay. Yvonne, do we have those slides? If you go to the third slide.
Guys, all of your mics work except for her. Oh, good. Yeah. Okay, so
Why don't you hang on to this then?
That's bad. I got the mic.
Oh.
That's great.
But just go to the third one. We don't need the first two. I think it's the third or the fourth, actually. Third or the fourth. Keep going. Okay, next one. So the issue here has to do with how the law decides who is a parent. And historically, the only way you could determine parentage legally was by giving birth to the child. And then from that point forward, marriage was the determining factor. If a couple was married, and if the child was born within 300 days, the statute says, if the family is living together, married, within 300 days of the birth of the child, the man is legally presumed to be the father. Can you go one more? Okay. This statute, Family Code 7613B, is the statute that affected the outcome in Jason's case. And what it says is that if a man provides semen to a physician for the purposes of inseminating an unmarried woman, he's legally prevented from being determined to be the father of the child that would result from that procedure. And this code section is in effect it's differently titled, but in about 43 states. It emanates from something called the Uniform Parentage Act, which was an attempt to make consistent through all of the 50 states the law that determined how someone would be found to be a parent. And if you strictly look at what the statute says, you see that in the situation where you're using IVF or even an IUI that's assisted by a physician, the man can be kept out of the relationship with the child. The reason for this is this statute was intended many years ago to protect basically two classes of people. sperm donors who wanted to simply donate their sperm and not have any relationship with the child and not have the parents come after them and seek child support, and infertile married couples who needed a sperm donor in order to have a child. But as we all know, reality has changed, and people have babies all kinds of ways in all kinds of different arrangements, not just the way Rachel has done it, but there's an issue now with same-sex couples having children. So the law hasn't, unfortunately, kept up with this. And what happened in Jason's case is that in the first phase of the case, the court actually gave him visitation with his son 5 days a week, in addition to some extra time via video chat, while the case worked its way through the system. And it did that because prior to their falling out, Jason had seen Gus regularly. When it came to the time of the trial, the argument that the mother made in the case was that Jason had given his sperm to a physician and she was an unmarried woman. And the thing that you have to think about, especially for this audience, if you're in a situation like this, is that you have to document legally, not only by signing the consent forms with the fertility clinic. And what happens on a practical basis is you go to the fertility clinic, they hand you a bunch of pre-printed forms, and they don't really get into who is going to be what and what role are they going to play. In fact, in this particular case, the fertility clinic identifies him as the father and them as a couple throughout. But what you need to do, our legislature did amend this statute about 4 years ago to provide that if there is a separate written agreement between the parties that defines them both as being the parents, then the father can legally stand as the father under the law. But the problem is, the average person on the street, or the person who's going through fertility or who's in a relationship and trying to have a baby, they don't think about this. And I know that there's, the age-old adage, ignorance of the law is no excuse. But the law has to change to accommodate these situations, and the doctors who are running these fertility clinics, in my opinion, have an obligation to tell people who come there that this is the problem and you need to see a lawyer to avoid being in a situation like Jason ended up in.
And don't you think, that it's kind of, to leave it to doctors to recommend that somebody see a lawyer is kind of like them doing nothing?
I agree, and I say that only because there's no other alternative here to protect people who are in his situation who wouldn't have known this. If you go to the clinic, and I'm sure you can speak to this, Jason, and you are given a series of forms, and every one of them says intended parent 1, intended parent 2, you assume that's because you're having this baby with this person. You don't realize that down the road someone is going to assert this. Now, there is a second statute. I think if you go forward one more slide, it might be on there. Nope, then go back one. There's a second statute that says that if there's a situation with a child who doesn't have a father and a man comes forward and says, this is my child, and holds this child out as his own child, son or daughter, to the public, and brings the child into his home, 7611D, he can legally be determined to be the father. And the reason I point this out is the policy of the law is to ensure that there are relationships between parents and children. And we want to make sure that children have fathers. And what's so shocking about the outcome in this case, which is now sitting in the Court of Appeal and going to be decided shortly, is that Jason being the biological father, based on the other statute we talked about, he's the only person in the world who couldn't claim parentage if this law was not changed. The only person, which makes no sense because he is the father. So this whole issue actually was presented to the legislature in an effort to amend the law, and it made its way through the California Senate under a bill known as SB 115, which passed unanimously, and then it got bogged down in the Assembly Judiciary Committee. And so the law, as we sit here today, is still the same as what you see on these slides, and other people in his situation are facing the same risk.
And anybody who also, people that are unmarried, you need to think about all the things that you might have in common with Jason's story, or the fact that even at some point, if you are unmarried and you couldn't get married wherever you are, which has been the case here in California, it got changed. Now you can. Maybe it gets changed back. So these are things, unfortunately, that everybody has to, be aware of, and hopefully that won't happen. But I want to ask you, Fred, just to give a sense of the other side. Daniel Schreiber's lawyers have argued that before the in vitro process, and this is after Jason had tried to have a baby through natural means with Danielle Schreiber. He tried another process to have a child with Danielle, and finally ended up with the IVF process. That he had written a letter, and it's something that gets plastered. For those of you who've seen anything about the case on television, it's been plastered over and over. What are your thoughts on what happens and how much role before the child is born? How much that letter should play, because it is something that keeps being argued by the other side, and I just wanted you to address it while we're sitting here in case everybody goes home and hears about this letter about that Jason wrote.
Okay. What I would say, aside from the letter, which I'll get to in a minute, just as a general rule, you have to work these things out ahead of time. And the person that you're going to have the child with, you have to come to an agreement, because that really is the indicator of what the intent is of both of the parents at the time the child is conceived. And it doesn't matter whether they're opposite sex parents, same sex parents, you still have those issues. It gets a little more complicated when same sex couples use a third party, which we can talk about in a few minutes, to have a child. But I think that there are two ways to look at this situation. One is, what was their intention at the time the child was conceived? But going back to the other code section, if somebody acts as the father and the child knows that person to be the father, the law accommodates, in the situation of 7611D, that individual and protects that relationship and says that he's the father. So in my view, that letter has nothing to do with anything, because after the letter was written, he was the father of the child for most of the child's life.
Okay,
So,
I just wanted you to address that just so that everybody would be properly informed. And let me go on to Rachel and ask you a few questions, and then we're gonna, have a little bit more time to go back over a few other things. But first of all, you and I, we were talking even before the session started, that you talk and talk about what can be done when two virtual strangers decide that they're going to parent together, and that there are different kinds of approaches. So what is it that when people come to you, and certainly in your own experience, I mean, how do you even begin to iron out the issues? And frankly, I have to say, independent of what happened in Jason's case, because there is so much documentation here of somebody already being a father. So I'm really asking you about the situation where two people are beginning this process, and what would they do at the beginning of the process to try to avoid problems down the road. I know Fred would sign them up in a whole bunch of different documents and make sure everything, all the I's, but what do they do personally to come to some sort of agreement, or what are the big issues that need to be resolved, in your opinion?
Well, as much as we like Fred, we can't rely on the law. We have to do our diligence. There are lots of issues. God, health, money, other relationships. Everything really needs to be diligently ironed out in an agreement so that everybody knows what's going on. Even that said, part of the agreement is how are we organically going to go forward when we have things go differently than we planned. You can have the most perfectly, you think, okay, we agreed on everything, we know it's going to happen, but what if something goes wrong? What is your way of solving that? Just Mother Nature is going to chime in on the whole thing, and a person who says, you know what, I'm married to my career, you can be the primary parent, I'll be more like an uncle person. Then he holds his baby, and that's out the window, because Mother Nature might kick in and he says, I can't be separated from this child. I have to see this child every day. This is the most important person in my life. But he may not have known that till she was born. And that's same for a mom. So these are really gooey, ooey, emotional environments that we're trying to create logical, rational agreements that then we can back up with some law. We have to really know ourselves very well, convey that to another human being, make and keep agreements, so that we can build families that are intact and last, and the kids have
It seemed to me that probably the major thing that you would have to have in common with somebody, that if you're going to have a child with someone you don't know, and not someone you've been in a long-term relationship with, again,
yes.
Totally, just to make the distinction here, but somebody that you don't know, that you have an accord that both of you will be acting in what you believe to be the best interest of the child.
Yes.
And to you, is that a two-parent family, or?
I don't think I think that children benefit from as many invested adults as they can have. And the paradigm about a two-person nuclear family is shifting and changing so much. even if you know the person that you're planning to have a child with, I think at minimum 12 months of active courtship and discovery process. Everything about how you were raised. I think the foster care system in Los Angeles County has an amazing parental preparation course called Pride. And Pride really teaches people how to parent in team and break these things down and all the subjects that are hard for us to think about. But that's kind of what it's about, parenting as a team, not just assuming the script that we were given in the conventional marriage. When you're doing a relationship like this, everything has to be discussed and negotiated. You can't assume things. Did I answer your question? I kind of got sidetracked.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now I want to go back a little bit back to Jason's situation and talk a little bit about how you've dealt with the fact that you haven't seen Gus in so long, what you've done to try to help others who, because because the law is so far behind, as Fred has explained, what you're doing to try to help others as you wait for your appeal to be heard and in your attempt to be able to see your son Gus. What are you doing for other people, and how have you been able to help others? Because you've actually discovered in this process that you're not the only person that this kind of situation is happening to.
Well, every day is just trying to survive. There's no manual for that. Anyone who's ever had their child taken away, it's every day you try to survive. So I found, what this is really to turn a child against another parent is just a horrible thing to do. And I found that there are a lot of these people that are suffering from this sort of parental alienation. And a lot of them started reaching out. And I decided that I wanted to start a foundation and use my voice, because I'm just an extreme example of parental alienation. I have an ex's family who has an incredible amount of money. They had 3 teams of lawyers. They found a statute, they perverted it, and took the child. There's other people who someone gets up and moves to South Carolina, and now someone can't see their kid. It's all the same thing. So I started this foundation called Stand Up for Gus, and we raised quite a bit of money and started a website that is a forum for people to go to. And what I did with the money, and on April 25th, is I've hired a lawyer at a pro bono firm, and that lawyer is going to represent parents completely free of charge that are desperately fighting for custody and have been tapped out from this horrible system, because it makes a lot of families broke, just trying to do this. So that lawyer is going to do, and I hope that's going to be a pilot program that will then try to put a lawyer like that in each state. So that's Stand Up for Gus, and you can go to standupforgus.com. And I am frankly leaving a trail. I'm blazing a trail for my son to know how much I love him. And there's plenty of parents who can't do that. So I want to be that voice. And I'm a private person, but I'm doing everything I can, because if someone stole your child, you put them on milk cartons. That's what you do. My milk cartons is going on The View or any of those things. So.
Fred, let me ask you, do you think that the family law courts really let down the child in Jason's situation? Did they really not have consideration for what was in the best interest of the child? Because as I listen, as I'm sitting here listening to Rachel, I keep thinking about all these other situations, not just Jason's situation, where people who've been married for years, who had plenty of time to talk out everything. You're talking about a year of courtship. That maybe you have a 20-year relationship, and they screw each other over and their children over relentlessly. So I'm a little skeptical about how that process that you're talking about would work. But I want to ask Fred, do you think that the family law, the courts are letting down people like Jason and other people in this area?
In this area, I have to say yes, because the court never got to assessing what was in the child's best interest. Based totally on the statute, the court decides someone doesn't have standing to come to court and say, I'm the father. I can't legally be determined to be the father. So in the court's view, there isn't a dispute between 2 parents at that point. There's a determination that one person is the parent, and that person makes all of the decisions for the child. Whereas in a more traditional situation, either in a divorce or an out-of-wedlock situation where both people have standing to claim that they are the parents, the court is supposed to decide as between those people who has the child's best interest at stake.
I'll tell you just a quick little anecdote. After the decision went down, we went to court a couple other times to try to get my visitation reinstated, and also just some various arguments. And I remember sitting there once. There was a few cases ahead of me, and the case that was right ahead of me as I sat there was a woman that was asking my judge to terminate the visitation of her husband, and he said, why? Because he's in jail for attempted murder. And he's on trial for attempted murder, but he's in jail for these other felonies. So he looked at the thing, and in about 2 seconds, granted. But just so you know, when he does get out, he can reapply for his visitation. So here I'm sitting with a man who's murdered somebody who can see his child, and I'm about to ask a guy who says, I am no longer the father of my child. The state of California comes in and takes my child away that I'd raised for 2.5 years without one accusation of abuse, with nothing. They just come in because they decided that a woman's rights, in this case, to be a single mother was more important than my rights as a man, and certainly more important than the child's rights.
And this is an area, I just want to add, that it's treated a little differently than things generally are. What Jason said is correct. There's such a strong legal presumption in favor of biological parents that, when there's a whole separate courthouse called dependency court that deals with children who are victims of neglect and abuse and have parents who have substance abuse problems and are put into foster care. And if you ever are in that courthouse, what you see happening over and over again are these parents coming back and saying, well, now I've cleaned myself up. Give me the child back. And so it puts the kids in a situation where they're in legal limbo because they can't be adopted, and they're sent back to these parents just based on biology alone. And then, of course, the parent reverts to the same substance abuse problem they had before, and the kid is taken away. And so they're like ping pong balls.
Well, I want to thank our panel, but now I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. Oh, you could do that. Okay. I'm going to open it up to see if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question for Jason and Fred. Doesn't the birth certificate have something to do with the legality? Because I kind of have a similar situation, but with mine, they're saying since you're on the birth certificate, you are the father regardless. So does that apply with these law? I don't know every law you're talking about, but does that apply?
The birth certificate, I'm looking for the microphone and it's on me. The birth certificate certainly gives a presumption that you're the father if you're identified on the birth certificate. And there are, interestingly, cases where a mother puts somebody on the birth certificate and then he wants to come to court and say, but I'm not the father. And you get into all these DNA testing issues. In this case, his name was not on the birth certificate.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. Because mine's the opposite. They're saying I'm the father and I'm not. And it's the complete opposite of yours. So the child's biologically not mine, but they're saying it's mine because my name's on the birth certificate.
Okay, so you have the converse situation, which is what I was talking about. That's not that uncommon.
Do you want to address that too, Jason? Anything about the person? No? Okay. There is, however, isn't there, Fred, situations where men's names in this process who are unmarried have been on the birth certificate and they still didn't have a presumption that they were that they had paternal rights?
Yes.
Any other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about maybe same-sex couples and using known donors?
Sure. Do you have a specific question in terms of a certain situation that you're interested in knowing the answer to?
No, I'm just assuming that this agreement is probably necessary in that case as well.
It is absolutely necessary. And what's interesting about this is, obviously, same-sex couples need another person's genetic material in order to have a child. If you don't have this documented in writing, it's changed a little bit now because same-sex marriage is now legal in California and it wasn't before. But oftentimes what happens, for example, with a gay male couple, you need an egg. So people will either do one of two things: have a friend who says, I'll carry the baby for you, or hire someone, a surrogate. The surrogate in California doesn't have any legal rights to the child as long as there is what we call a gestational carrier agreement signed by everyone prior to the fertility treatment taking place. If you don't have that agreement, then you're at risk because the legal presumption is the surrogate gave birth to the child. If it's all documented ahead of time, then the surrogate can't in California. And this isn't the case in many states, including a number of major East Coast states like New York. Surrogacy is illegal and these things don't get upheld. But here they do. The other issue is, and I don't know how many people are aware of this, there was a bill that was passed last legislative session that said a child can now have more than 2 parents. So sometimes in these same-sex situations, if you agree ahead of time, you could have a situation where a child could have 2 mothers and a father, 2 fathers and a mother. But you have to document all of this ahead of time, because if you don't, you get into this quagmire, and you have to document it in 2 regards. Same-sex couples who are not married, and this affects a lot of out-of-state couples who then move or either live in a state where they can get married and move to a state where it isn't legal, oftentimes have to, and we had to do this too prior to the change in the law, have a second parent adoption, because one party is biologically related to the child and that person, there's no dispute over it. A common example of this is you have a gay male couple that either uses a friend or a surrogate, and they mix the sperm and inseminate, and then only one of them obviously is biologically the father of the child. The other one would then have to do a second parent adoption. In the situation where you have a lesbian couple, you have the same issue, because one gives birth and she has the legal presumption that she's the mother, and the other one then has to have her parentage established as well if they haven't done it ahead of time, which you can do going back to the statutes. I'm looking at the slide, it's not there, but you can document it ahead of time to solve that problem.
Pertaining to that question, can I ask you a question, Fred?
I think you're allowed to.
I think I'm allowed to, because I think it might help.
Go for it.
So if a lesbian couple wants to have a known donor, a friend of theirs, give the sperm, but does not want them to be a father or argue or be, can they do it through a sperm bank?
Yes, most sperm banks, I shouldn't say most, all sperm banks, will have people sign waivers saying that they are giving the sperm and they don't intend to maintain any rights to the child. And people will pay for the sperm through a sperm bank and intentionally go through the sperm bank because their intention is not to have any relationship. You can do the same thing with a known donor. A known donor can waive his rights to parentage.
Do you think there's a little more protection since the law is kind of doing this? It's a little bit more protection?
I think it is protection. I think if the known donor waives his rights, then he's out.
Okay.
Okay, I had a question for Jason too. Actually, I saw the Today Show with your ex and her lawyer, and the lawyer said something about that she wasn't opposed to you having some involvement, but she wanted to be the main parent. Was that never discussed? And then maybe eventually you guys can get to more of a co-parenting situation. I didn't understand.
They have not. That Today Show appearance, I went on the next day and said, "I'll meet you anywhere in the world to see my son." It had been 20 weeks at that point. It's now 38. They've not responded positively to any of our letters, any of my offers, or any of our legal letters.
I think we have a question.
Fred, I have a question about the culpability of the clinics. Number one, why would they give someone forms to sign if they have no meaning? And number two, what is their responsibility now and going forward to inform a couple of what this document you're signing means and what you should do to protect yourself? Do they have any culpability?
Most of these clinics, in their set of forms, there is a paragraph that says you should talk to a lawyer. But what happens, and Jason can probably speak to this better than me, so when you go in there, they'll hand you 20 pages of forms. You're there with the purpose of having a child. You don't necessarily pick up on that. But the legal position is they've advised you that they're just dealing with the medical procedures. And so I don't think, it's really not a question in my area, but I don't think that they necessarily have any legal obligation beyond that if down the road there's a dispute between the parents over parentage.
Okay, I think we have time for one more audience question, then Allison will wrap up.
I'm just curious if there was money exchanged. For example, IVF obviously isn't always covered under insurance. If he had helped supplement, or if he had helped her financially through this process, would that have given him any legal rights, any additional legal rights, if he paid for it?
Well, the issue is you still have the statute. He still provided his sperm to a physician, and what he said earlier is correct. Had he not done that, had they done this at home, and it sounds crude, but people do use turkey basters a lot of times and do these things on their own. And in those situations, we as family law attorneys kind of joke about it's a turkey baster case when you end up in court with these things. Those situations, that person, both of those people who were parties to that are the parents. The law doesn't get into it based upon who paid for the procedure.
But if you want your question answered, he did give her a great deal of money. I mean, and that's certainly been his position, and I interviewed him on that. So the legal answer is Fred's. If you want to know if it happened, yes, there was. I mean, he did give her a great deal of money. He did take care. He did also pay for schooling. He went to a school interview as the father, along with his ex. So just to give you a broader sense in that. And this gentleman had one last question. Do we have time for that? Sure.
My name is Peter Thomas Sinise. I am the International Executive Director of the Eye Care Foundation and the chairman, I have a bad voice, the chairman of the Special Commission reporting to the Secretary General of the Hague Conference. I'm going to stand up. This issue that we're now dealing with, we're hearing the words parental alienation. Mr. Patrick, this is abduction, and it's abduction at the highest level. I wanted to share with you as a father who has, the Eye Care Foundation has brought home, I think it's 148 internationally kidnapped children in 3 years. We have prevented thousands, literally thousands, of abductions. The issue of in vitro abduction is really the Wild West of abduction in our global society. I wanted to let you know a couple of things. You haven't seen your son in over a year. I wanted you to know, as a parent who has been there alongside literally almost every family that we have reunited, even at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, your son knows you. Your son is waiting for you. And in the darkness of your night, and I'm sure you have it because you're missing your child, don't ever think that he's not thinking of you. The Hague Conference is now in the process of creating a special commission to deal very specifically with in vitro abduction. I think your message and the message of this panel has absolutely reached the global community. I wanted you to know that. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to thank all of our guests. I know.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Now we're all upset. It was very well said. I want to thank Rachel for being here and urge you to read her book. I think that she raises a lot of the really important issues that people need to be thinking about, and certainly just that sometimes they don't think about, and it's such a complicated process, and we're having all different kinds of families, and that's fine, but you want to protect yourself so that the best you can, so that that everybody knows what role they're going to be playing in the family the best that you can predict, that sort of thing. Things happen, but I also want to thank Fred for being here and giving us some guidance on what's happening with the law. If you want to get involved in that, you should, and you certainly should. If this is something that you're interested in doing, contact a lawyer or give Fred a call or give somebody who works in the area that whatever your concern is. And I also want to thank Jason for sharing his very personal story with everyone. And I want to thank you all for coming. And if you want to see, Jason has appeared on a number of different shows. He also there's a Facebook page devoted to Stand Up for Gus. He's also been on my show on Media Mayhem, and because I thought it was an important issue, and it's something that people aren't covering enough. And I see, with your book, it is so much more complex than anybody even knows.
I have 10 copies. For
She has, okay, so you have 10 copies, yeah. So first 10 people are the winners. And thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for having us.
Thank you.